In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, I hope that you visited our YouTube channel and seen the video stations of the cross that Colby and Kathy Roberts put together with Bill's wonderful organ music. I love the way the camera takes us through the familiar front doors of our church, which is such a sacred place for us. The only thing missing is that wonderful scent of incense lingering in the air. Please take some time today or tomorrow on Holy Saturday to visit the Stations of the Cross as a prayer practice. The Stations of the Cross depict the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Sorrows. They trace Jesus' painful walk through Jerusalem to Golgotha and his death. On Palm Sunday, we read the Passion account from the Gospel of Matthew, which contains many of those scenes from the Stations. Jesus is condemned, mocked, tortured, and when he takes up his cross, he falls several times from exhaustion and pain. Simon of Cyrene is pulled off the street to carry the cross for him. And Jesus dies crying out to God, and finally he is buried. That is what we expect to experience on Good Friday, the agonizing death of Jesus. Today, on Good Friday, we read a very different account of Jesus' passion from the Gospel of John. I think it's important to point out the differences between John's account and Matthew's. As we experience the solemnity and pathos of Good Friday, John's account of the Passion may surprise us. I think that John spins us around and points us in a new direction towards the good in Good Friday. John's Gospel account starts in a garden, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to record this outside today. But the garden at the beginning of John's Gospel account of the Passion is not called the Garden of Gethsemane like the garden in Matthew. It is not a place of agony. And I'll come back to what garden I think it is towards the end of our time together. Jesus leads his disciples to this garden as if he has an appointment to meet Judas and the police who come to the garden to arrest him. Judas plays a much smaller part in John's account. There is no kiss of betrayal, no 30 pieces of silver, no suicide. Judas simply brings the armed mob to Jesus, and Jesus came forward and meets them, saying, "I am he," which echoes the numerous "I am" statements earlier in the Gospel of John. Jesus is dignified and calm in the face of danger. When Peter tries to defend him with a sword, Jesus says to him, "Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Jesus is focused on his mission. In Matthew's Passion, Jesus mostly stands mute before the religious authorities and Pilate. But in John's account, Jesus speaks truth to power. Twice, Jesus spells out his mission to Pilate. He says, "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate responds, "What is truth?" In the interplay between Pilate and Jesus, we see the contrast between God's eternal truth and the shifting, often corrupt nature of worldly power, which we see so much right now. In their second encounter, Jesus and Pilate face off at high noon, just the two of them. And Jesus says to Pilate, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above." This encounter between them happens on a specific date and time that is unique to the Gospel of John. It is the day of preparation for Passover, the day when thousands of lambs were carried to the temple to be slaughtered, and their blood poured over the altar as a sacrifice. Noon on the day of preparation was the high point of this temple ritual, when scholars believe the lamb's blood was overflowing the sacrificial altar and running down the steps of the temple. The symbolism of Jesus being condemned to death at noon on the day of preparation would have been obvious to the early Christians who knew the temple traditions. In John's Gospel, Jesus carries his cross himself. He does not fall. Jesus' walk towards Golgotha is not a way of sorrow. It is a way of victory. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, writes about John's passion account and the cross as victory in his little book called The Sign and the Sacrifice. He says, quote, "What all these texts in John's Gospel tell us is that the cross is a victory, because in a sense the victory has already been won in the life of Jesus. He has conquered because he has in each moment given himself in unreserved love, dedication, and obedience to God and to the needs of the world. And Jesus' acceptance of the cross as part of his obedience is the way in which he makes his passion into an action. He turns an experience in which he is passive at the mercy of others into something that is active and allows God's own action to flood through the world." Once at Golgotha, John simply says, "There they crucified him." The emphasis is not on his pain and suffering, but on his self-offering to give himself freely on the cross. When Jesus speaks from the cross in the Gospel of John, he speaks calmly to his mother and the beloved disciple. He's not speaking out of pain and desperation. This also has a symbolic meaning. When he speaks to his mother Mary and the beloved disciple John and says, "Here is your son," Jesus reorders family and tribe into a wider gathering of believers, us. If Mary is the earthly source of Jesus' life, she now becomes the mother of a new family, perhaps mother to all of us. We can see Jesus make that happen from the cross. These are the seeds of the new, developing Christian community. Finally, Jesus says, "It is finished." John says he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. In the Gospel of John, we see Jesus intentionally choose when to give up his life. His life was in no way taken from him by the Romans or the religious authorities. Rowan Williams writes, quote, "As if slipping off a garment, Christ shrugs off the leaden weight of those powers that keep us less than human. And on the cross, as the body of Jesus is nailed there, so too is nailed metaphorically the account that his death has canceled. He has written off our debt, and when we look at him nailed there, what we see is all that we owe in fear and guilt, nailed up with a red line through it." Just as it began in the garden where Jesus meets his betrayer, John's account of the Passion ends in a garden where Jesus is buried. We are reminded of the Garden of Eden here, at the beginning and at the end of the Passion account. Adam, the first human, was expelled from the Garden of Eden with Eve. Symbolically, Jesus becomes Adam leaving the garden again when he meets Judas and is arrested in the garden at the beginning of the Passion story. When Jesus is buried in John's Gospel, he is returned to the garden. And he, I believe, becomes a seed planted in the earth, the new Adam, who reconciles us to God and replants us in the Garden of Eden, too. I find the combination of the 4 accounts of the Passion to be essential to our understanding of Jesus' mission and to our own faith. Throughout history, people of faith have identified with the suffering of Christ on the cross because human life contains suffering. Jesus' suffering on the cross links our suffering with God who suffers with us, and it transforms our suffering into something holy, something sacramental. John's Gospel offers us another view of the same events. John shows us the intent beneath Jesus' journey to the cross. It shows Jesus fulfilling his mission from God. In the process, John shows us a portrait of humility and purpose. It reminds me of martyrs like Oscar Romero, who died behind the altar saying Mass. It reminds me of the priest that I recently heard of in New York City, who was on a ventilator during our current COVID-19 outbreak, and he gave up his ventilator for somebody younger. Jesus' humility and confidence in the face of death offers us an image we can meditate upon. With God's grace, we can grow in faith day by day, so that we may live out our ministries with humility and purpose. In this time of pandemic, we wonder and we ponder the meaning of this great self-offering of God. We see it with new eyes. It seems more relevant as we shelter in place against an invisible virus, an invisible foe. With God's grace, we can persevere. And with God's grace, someday we will meet our own death with conviction and peace. As an interim, I am always looking for signs of transformative grace in our lives together as a faith community. And in the coming days, I invite you to join me in looking for those signs of transformative grace here in the Gospel of John and in our lives together going forward. In John, Jesus is the Messiah for the whole world, who lays down his life for his friends and for us. Jesus says, "It is finished," and yet there is more to the story. John's Gospel reorients us towards the future, towards newness of life, towards the resurrection. Amen.